So thank you everyone for joining us in this especially sad day for all of us. I think, of course, the news. I think we will be able to to feel the impact of these horrible news and horrible news that we received today throughout the entire country. So as I wrote to you in the email, I think it's I see this session as some way for just 2 short hours to put these strong emotions to the side, or maybe actually use them, and but to focus right now on what we love, which is musicology, specifically ethnomusicology. And I really want to thank Professor Wong for joining us, because it means a lot for us, I think, for all of our speakers in every date, but especially today. I think it means so much that you were kind enough to come and speak for us, and that we feel part of the international community. That's absolutely I think one great feature of these meetings. So thank you so much. I think we can just start basically, and I want to introduce you now formally. So Professor Deborah Wong is an ethnomusicologist and professor emerita of music at the University of California, Riverside. She has written 3 books: Louder and Faster, Pain, Joy, and the Body Politic in Asian American Taiko, Speak It Louder, Asian Americans Making Music, and Sounding the Center, History and Aesthetics in Thai Buddhist Ritual. She served as editor for Nobuko Miyamoto's extraordinary memoir, Not Your Butterfly, My Long Song of Relocation, Race, Love, and Revolution. Committed to public sector work at the national, state, and local levels, she serves on the board of Great Leap, a nonprofit community arts organization with an Asian American focus. She hosts a weekly radio show titled Gold Mountain for KUCR 88 FM in Riverside, and she also was a member of the Taiko Center of Los Angeles for many years and still dances Bonodori every summer in Southern California open gatherings. She is a core member of the collaborative team that recently published the oral history book Riverside Women Creating Change, Stories and Inspiration from Activists and Organizers. So I think that's enough for me and my broken English. Deborah, please take the stage. We're absolutely looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Schossberger, for making all of this possible and for the leadership you're obviously providing to the IMS. I'm so curious and so impressed already. I'm very happy to meet all of you. I hope we have other ways to meet each other as the months and years go on, at conferences and such like. I should say that I'm treating my presentation today as a chance to prepare the introduction to a book. Much more to be said about that. But this is very much a rough first draft. I've gotten to a point in my life and my thinking where I often don't present like polished work, but instead I use these talks as an opportunity to make new work better, so I am inviting your responses and your questions and your ideas about what to do with this. I should say that, forgive me, I've put no AV into my PowerPoint. I've made very little effort to make this a big multimedia presentation. I've been so focused on the writing, to be honest with you, preparing the book. I want to thank in advance the 2 respondents, Professor Abigail Wood and Rachel Pinhasi, because it takes work to do this kind of thing. To be a respondent is hard work, and I appreciate what you've done in advance. I want to invite all of you to use the chat if you like, as I talk, you don't have to wait until I'm like done. Feel free to put in questions, in the moment, gut level responses, whatever. Feel free to use the chat. I would really welcome that. And I want to thank several people for being here, to my delight. I should say that Kate Alexander, who we can actually has her video camera on, thank you, is joining us from the University of Arizona. She's an ethnomusicologist and has taught there for quite a long time at this point. Some of my past lives in Thailand, Tirawit Jui is here to my complete and utter surprise. Ajahn Tirawit, it's great to see you. And there's two members, two authors who are in the book. There you are. Hey, sawadee ka. There's Professor Takako Iwasawa and Professor Tony Shapiro Pim, I thought. Wait, I just lost her. Maybe she went back. Oh, hi, your camera came on. Hi. Two authors from the book are here, which makes me a little nervous because they haven't yet read what I've written, so this is the beginning of more conversations, obviously. And Takako, I think it's like 3 a.m. in Japan, so I am that much more surprised that you are here. All right, enough preamble. Let me get to the presentation. And may I also invite all of you, if I am talking too fast, or I should say reading too fast, well, actually, I can't see the chat now. Well, you're just going to have to say, slow down. You're going to have to turn on your microphone and say, slow down, please. Okay. All right, I'm gonna start reading at this point. And I think that what I have is 45 minutes long. That's my hope. Yeah. All right. I ask, hold on here. There we go. I asked two sets of questions in this presentation, which is the draft introduction to an edited collection titled Connection, Empathy, and the Performing Arts. So first big, long, involved question is, first, how is the framework of conviviality useful at this historic moment? When we focus on music and empathetic connection across difference, what does this bring to an area of music scholarship now dominated by attention to conflict, trauma, and violence? What's gained and what's lost by focusing on the reparative? Second, how can I honor the intentions of a colleague whose research was dedicated to these questions? So is it too soon to redirect conflict studies toward conviviality? My late colleague, Yoshitaka Tarada, chose the term conviviality to sum up how music can connect communities across fraught histories of conflict. Initially, I wondered whether the word, and indeed the focus, was a bit too idealistic. I'm finalizing an edited collection, a book, that draws together work by 9 scholars on music and conviviality. We were brought together by Yoshitaka Tarada. He first approached me about this project in 2017. In fact, it was over breakfast at the ICTM conference in Limerick. And we then worked on it from 2019, after he'd gotten a grant, to 2023, through several in-person convenings at his home institution of the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka. We then worked during the pandemic with a group of about 12 scholars through remote gatherings to share and to present work to one another. And finally, Tarada spent a month-long residency at my university in California in 2022, so we could begin editing the chapters for the book. And he then unexpectedly died in March of 2023. I will come back to his death later in this presentation to reflect on the weirdly asymmetrical process of writing without him while trying to represent his thoughts and intent. For now, I'll simply say that I don't yet have a publisher for the book, that I will list us as co-editors, and that the introduction to the book, which you are hearing me read right now, will be published as co-authored. Literally, I'm the author putting together the words and ideas. In other significant ways, I'm trying to honor Tarada's ideas. And below, I will reflect, as I go on, I will reflect more deeply on writing with and without a co-author. I write this introduction on unceded and occupied land in Southern California, where living Native American communities are my neighbors and my colleagues. The Cahuilla, the Tongva, the Serrano, and the Luiseño peoples all live in this area of Southern California. Now, I live and I write at the foot of a small mountain right out the window there, known as Pachapa to local Native Americans, and as Mount Rubidoux in settler colonial Riverside. And in fact, this mountain has been renamed for this 19th century white explorer and land developer. In other words, I think and write in a contact zone, a living contact zone. And I'm still learning how to acknowledge those unconvivial layers and relationships in ways that don't seem, over and done once uttered. North American Indigenous protocols for encounter offer important ethical terms for how to convene. And those protocols have been taken further and developed into research methods that decolonize the very terms for encounters across ways of knowing. As Linda Tuiwai-Smith wrote, quote, in First Nations and Native American communities, there are protocols for being respectful, of showing or accepting respect, and reciprocating respectful behaviors, which also develop membership, credibility, and reputation. Now, that is precisely what the research in our book addresses. Such protocols have implications far, far beyond the pragmatics of doing research in, with, or on Native American communities. And even as I'm seemingly extracting Indigenous protocols for my own use, I remind myself that Tuiwai-Smith was clear about who such methods are for. She wrote, quote, what is more important than what alternatives Indigenous peoples offer the world is what alternatives Indigenous peoples offer each other, close quote. These methods were not meant for me or us. Yet, as decolonial thought has swept through the ethnographic disciplines in North America, some of the most productive models for encounter come from communities that live under conditions of uneven human rights and limited civil liberties. Can or should outsiders draw from them? When Terada began using the word and rubric of conviviality, I assumed he was evoking convivencia, the golden period of intercultural community in Spain before the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims in the late 15th century and before. And I also assumed he had heard of the Zapatista value of convivencia, which is a principle of the encuentro, the gathering. As I have learned from the Southern California Son Jarocho community that I write about in my own chapter for this book. But neither was the case. He did not mean those ideas about convivencia. Terada was, in fact, just searching for a single word that could encapsulate the opposites of conflict and violence. And as a bilingual, oh, sorry. Oh, Henry Spiller, hi. As a bilingual Japanese and English speaker, he found a term that allowed him to address the productive and connective work that communities do with music, especially minority communities. Now, this is what he wrote in 2019 to 2020. I drew some writing that he had done for grant purposes and for introducing our symposium series for the authors. So this is Yoshitaka Terada's writing. With the worldwide resurgence of racism, sexism, and xenophobia, harmonious coexistence is one of the most urgent and challenging issues we need to address today. How can people of diverse social and cultural backgrounds, political ideologies, and religious faiths live together with mutual respect and empathy? Coexistence can be divided into two types, passive and active. The former refers to the state in which tangible forms of discrimination may not be apparent, but, sorry, I can't see part of the screen here. But aversion and prejudice continue to exist between groups and individuals. In passive coexistence, a xenophobic tendency and I'm losing my place because I can't quite see the right part of my screen, and indifference to others can be a perilous hotbed for more tangible forms of discrimination and oppression. In active coexistence, differences are not only mutually tolerated, but are respected and celebrated. In this project, we call this type of coexistence conviviality. He goes on and he writes, the performing arts are frequently believed to be endowed with the power to unite, harmonize, and heal people. But this assumption needs to be examined carefully, as they have also been used to divide, to intimidate, or more directly to hurt people. The purpose of this book is to explore and identify the frameworks and conditions in which the performing arts can be effective in creating conviviality by cross-examining case studies undertaken in diverse situations. So that was Yoshitaka Terada's writing about this project and where he was coming from. And in setting the stage for the book, Terada's word choices for the desired thing are important. He acknowledged music's roles in violence and division, but he turns decidedly toward coexistence and even harmonious coexistence, mutual respect and empathy, peace building, an amicable world, a power to unite, harmonize, and heal. He didn't evoke empathy in this early statement of purpose for the project, but was clearly headed in that direction by noting music, as he put it, affecting human senses and emotions in ways distinct from other media. So the book is titled Connection, Empathy, and the Performing Arts, his choice of title. And it, developed over about 4 years' time with the 9 authors, actually a few more. We don't have a publisher yet. I'm working on that. That's at the top of my list right now. And I just want you to have a chance to see who's in the book and what their chapters are about. All of this still very much in motion. The 9 authors' research reaches from Japan to India, Thailand, Malaysia, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. And their research addresses music in slum communities, music as a means to reach across caste divides in a university environment in India, intra-ethnic performance in deeply multi-ethnic cities, intentional efforts to use music to build confidence in troubled youth and with disability communities, ethnic minority community building in dense urban environments, co-producing a documentary, a film with and about refugee singers, and several chapters address liberation projects focused on bringing aggrieved minority communities into conversation through music. So it's pretty rich stuff, and I'm just so pleased and proud to be working directly with these amazing scholars. This book is and isn't another collection of applied ethnomusicological case studies, as useful as I think such books are. Our emphasis is a bit different, I think. I suggest that the genealogies of musicians' strategies for living beside one another are critically powerful. They always take place within the tight spaces of capitalist covenants and imperial infrastructures, yet they often, or sometimes, or hopefully, offer ideas for how to shift those terms. Those genealogies must be known and understood because they create sedimented histories and memories of struggle and response. Social justice relies on those memories. The work of this project on music and conviviality falls broadly within engaged ethnomusicology as an area. Ethnomusicologists are still trying to fully meet and rise to the challenge raised by what used to be called applied ethnomusicology. A bigger question framed by this book, but unevenly answering it, is why applied or engaged researchers are often most focused on case studies. The unique conditions of each case are often respected to the point that it is difficult to rise above or beyond them. The best research offers not only data, to my mind, but also models and ideas. But sometimes the area can seem more like a rich and ever-growing set of case studies. I look at Yoshitaka Terada's career, and I see with newfound clarity his sustained attention to difference, place, presence, and dignity. He leaves behind a long list of films and publications based on stunningly good research. Terada showed what it means to do sustained long-term ethnographic research in communities that live under conditions of oppression, invisibility, and unimportance. He did lots of research in Osaka, where he lived, give or take. In fact, you're looking at an image of the taiko group Kizuna made up of buraku entirely. It's this really radical effort for groups formerly known as, untouchable, as it were, to come together and use music to develop new ways of being, right? And to challenge mainstream society. So his Osaka-based music research on Okinawans, Koreans, and buraku offers models for how minority communities find ways to flourish despite real constraints, ideally. He was such a careful researcher that he never tells the reader or viewer what the takeaway lesson is. Instead, the musicians in his work, the musicians tell us directly, quoted carefully. Terada never offered a model, but he certainly published work that documented how musicians in minority communities articulate responses to oppression. Further, his research was conducted over long time spans, so his published analyses offer no rush to understanding, but instead remarkably longitudinal and situated cultural work. As I understand it, Terada's purpose was to offer principled case studies rather than high-level cultural theory. The place where Terada's interests and mine converge is in how minority communities take music very seriously as a means to redefine their social orders. As ethnomusicologists, we both conducted ethnographic research. In fact, we met, Terada and I, in the late 1990s when we were each researching taiko in Asian American circles. And for me, researching Asian American activist musicians through the critical lens of Asian American studies has allowed me to move between different communities and genres, asking questions that exceed ethnographic particularities. My work is explicitly theoretical, whereas Terada was gently suspicious of theory. Terada turned to the ICTMD study group on music and minorities for ideas and answers, whereas I turned to US-based ethnic studies for ideas. But we met in the center, where we wanted to see and hear how minority musicians articulate counter-narratives about their community's futures. So, conviviality, since minority-majority dynamics are the tight corners in which our friends, teachers, and interlocutors do their work. So what might it mean to, model conviviality, dignity, and world peace while we're at it, right? At some level, I think researchers imagine we are adding to a huge compilation of solutions, a huge collection of models for living otherwise. Such research can blur the distinctions between studying and doing, examining and proposing, and the descriptive and prescriptive. Perhaps it's enough to just offer another good compendium of models like so many other collections have been. But I hope our book is a little more than that. I think our book shows how the communities that work so hard to create better ways of living together are also modeling how music research can be reimagined. I think our work is already doing that, but sometimes with overly modest aims. The scholars in this book address concord and convergence as well as failure and coercion. Some of the scholars in this book conducted their research and then turned to other projects, but some have spent their professional careers and lives immersed quite deeply in the long work of change over time across generations. Some have founded institutes focused on music and conviviality. Some have helped write public policy for their community and nation. Some have transformed the class structure of their university through music programs, and so on. In short, this book is about more than studying or researching how communities take care of business. The book is as much about how their models for living together and alongside could change how ethnomusicologists do our work. We are not studying down. We are learning how to position our cultural work to do more than simply name oppressions. We commit to doing something beyond critique as a project in itself. We can approach extraordinary community efforts as more than simply case studies, but instead as disciplinary provocations. At the same time, the terms for peaceful or productive coexistence are never self-evident. the specificity of the encounter is it's always unique, and so too are the needs. Each community draws from and continuously adds to its own archive of possible futures. Okay, I'm going to turn to my next section. You should stretch and shift around a little. I realize it's now evening. Have you finished your dinner? If not, why don't you keep eating? You can listen and eat at the same time. We know how to do that. I'm going to keep going. You feel free to, keep yourselves alive and lively as I proceed here. So my next section is about post-idealism in music studies. I love the work of Josh Pilzer, an American ethnomusicologist who teaches in Toronto. And he wrote this review that really gave me a lot to think about. And in it, he asked, can ethnomusicologists think about music and conflict, as he puts it, without recourse to the rosy and unreflective assumptions about music's positive social value that have often fogged music scholarship? Great question, Josh. And for me, these assumptions rely on, post-Enlightenment ideas about the transcendence of music, which is precisely what the authors in our book do not evoke, mostly. And I think it's difficult not to be influenced by the presumption that music does good and, is good, right? Because we're music scholars and musicians. But the response to conflict isn't ever simple. And peace isn't the absence of violence. What are the desired outcomes? Mediation, resolution, and reconciliation are never easy or obvious. And so case studies, they're omnipresent in the area, since the particularities of conflict mean that there are never too many methodologies for addressing it. But there's a problem with redemption narratives, as Josh Pilzer calls them, because they're self-fulfilling. And by that, I mean that as music scholars, we want so badly for music to make a difference in the world. And we know that musicians articulate the change that's going to come. We've seen how that has or can be the outcome. Ethnomusicologists in the global north have done an extraordinary amount of work on music and social movements. But the turn toward convivial relations can seem to me a bit utopian and even a bit post-racial at times. And in writing this, now that I've written that, I can sense Tarada's impatience with my US-centered laser focus on critique and my inability to imagine a world beyond that framework. Because, in fact, many scholars, music scholars, have very carefully done the hard work of looking closely at how music can scaffold and support and promote hate, violence, and genocide. Our book, and I'm just, I want you, these are just some of the sources I'm talking about. There are many. Our book activates a bit of a journey through changing emphases over the last 40 years of music scholarship. I'd say that the convivial turn emerged at a distinct moment in post-colonial studies, and I feel obliged to look at it here in ways that Tarada perhaps would not have chosen to do. A critical interest in conviviality emerged in the humanities at the same time in the early 2000s, about 25 years ago, when ethnomusicologists turned wholesale towards researching music and violence. These three collections defines the area in the decade following 9/11. This book first, and then these two came out in pretty short order. These three collections defines the area in the decade following 9/11 in 2001. And at this point, IMS, AMS, and SEM, which are arguably the major music scholarly organizations, each of them have study groups devoted to violence, the study of music and violence. This study came out just a few years ago in 2023. Since 9/11, musicologists and ethnomusicologists have focused overwhelmingly on violence, trauma, and war. And as recently as 2011, John O'Connell, who's been really key to the area, he was able to declare accurately that, quote, The study of music in war and music for peace has received surprisingly little attention in ethnomusicology, close quote. I would say that has changed dramatically in the recent past, in the last decade, not least thanks to John O'Connell's work. And over a tight 5-year period, these 3 excellent collections were published, and they promptly inspired a flood of ethnomusicological scholarship. And strikingly, all 3 collections focused as much on musicians' responses to violence as on violence itself. And from my perspective, the bedrock for research on conviviality was set in place by these foundational works. They addressed agentive responses to violence and conflict in remarkably sustained ways. Very few of the many scholars in those books presented violence as its own subject. Most focused on how musicians created or transmitted the terms for life after violence or under continuing violence. As such, the area was and is marked by a commitment to researching music and violence as advocacy. Now, music scholars have addressed conviviality very, very sparingly. The word hardly appears in the music scholarship, only in a few works. These 2 scholars on the screen are not music scholars, but Linda Lapina articulates my unease around the idea of conviviality, noting that it is, quote, a concept increasingly used to denote unproblematic encounters with diversity, close quote. And as Amit Singh succinctly sums up how the convivial turn sometimes strips the idea, quote, of its radical and political potential, unquote. So long story short, multiculturalism appeared in North America in the 1990s and dominated higher education curricula by the turn of the millennium. And it was then promptly co-opted by corporate capitalism as a superficial mechanism of celebration, necessitating as little structural change as possible, which then led to backlash and the rise of the right in most of the global North. Boy, that was long story short. But let me say that Paul Gilroy explored a certain version of conviviality in the UK with the post-colonial lens he had already developed in earlier work. In this book, After Empire, which came out in 2004, I think, he reflected on the ideal of convivial relationships without resorting to what he called the absence of racism or the triumph of tolerance. He posited that conviviality could have a certain radical openness if approached as a means to think beyond fixed identity ideologies. And that radicalism for him is based in an unabashed humanism. He uses that phrase that relies on a critique of racial hierarchy. Gilroy's interest in conviviality, is in no way utopian. It is unsentimental. Indeed, it is an agentive response to structural inequities. He uses the word multiculture to refute multiculturalism as an ideology and to return attention to how communities live with difference at ground level. He posits the multiculture as a place where concrete oppositional work, as he writes, takes place as a result of pressure from below. He acknowledges that, quote, the desire to dwell convivially with difference can appear naive, trifling, or misplaced in the face of deepening global inequalities and conflicts over resources on one side, and a routine, almost banal multiculture on the other, close quote. And he focuses on the convivialities that can emerge from anti-racist work. He writes about the negative dialectics of conviviality, placing his questions squarely within our Frankfurt School framework, focusing on critique without the expectation of resolution, and on the tensions between possible outcomes as critically generative. So you can tell I'm getting a lot from Paul Gilroy's thinking on conviviality. Now, Tarada quoted Gilroy in at least one of his, pre-writings about this project. I don't know to what extent he was planning to use it in our book. We talked quite a bit about the social and political terms for encounter through music. We debated whether intent is important. We agreed that musical sounds and practices matter. We both hoped that music could make a difference, but Tarada, I think, was more certain than I that music does make a difference. And after weeks and weeks of discussion, wonderful discussion, Tarada and I crafted a set of 12 guiding questions for the symposium and then book participants to encourage through lines, right? And we suggested to our scholars that they try to address at least several of the questions, but not all of them, right? Not all of them, certainly not all of them. So let me just quickly walk you through the 12 questions. I'm literally just going to read them to you. Question 1, how does music help create the means and the terms for productive relationships between different communities and within a community? 2, where did the ideas for that music come from? Did those ideas move from the top down or the bottom up? What models or existing ideas were used to create the music that connects different communities? What pre-existing ideologies shape the terms for connection? 3, what does this music sound like? Who performs it and for whom? Does it have a lasting presence, or is it ephemeral, serving short-term needs? Has it remained within the communities and encounters and questions, or has it been commercialized and commodified? 4, does music also outline, hold on, I can't see that word on the right. Does music also outline important kinds of difference between the communities in question? Did the communities choose to, sorry, I'm moving all of your faces around. Did the communities choose to change their music in order to support the needed connections? 6, what words or terminology do the communities in question use to talk about purposeful connection across difference? What histories of violence and conflict must be acknowledged to overcome before arriving at affinity, reconciliation, or connection? 8, does the music of encounter appeal to communities outside or beyond the ones trying to forge better relationships? 9, how do we evaluate the ability of the performing arts to affect the emotions? 10, what are the conditions in which performing arts can create and sustain empathy toward others? 11, what roles do scholars and activists need to play to help make connections between communities? And finally, 12, how can we use audiovisual media to activate empathy, affinity, and understanding? So those are the 12 guiding questions. And we gave our scholars, our authors, the invitation to pick and choose, but to try to, hit at least some of them. I now notice in our carefully generated set of 12 questions that we did not use the word conviviality in them, and that the word empathy appears rather quickly and late in our list. And we didn't ask our authors really to reflect on those two words, conviviality and empathy. I think I will circle back to the authors at this point. I think I will ask them each if they could specifically address question 1 and question 6. I'm thinking about how to sort of take a second pass on some of these things. And I wonder how to push ourselves to do more than simply say music sometimes provides people with the means to get to a new place or consider a more just set of values. I wonder how much I can ask our authors to think beyond their case studies. They've already done so much hard work. Can I ask them to do a little bit more? I think I'm going to try. In sum, this book enacts a key tension in conviviality studies. Some of the chapters offer a post-idealist focus on productive relationships through music. Other chapters are decidedly utopian, and I think mine is guilty of that. The unresolved strains between these approaches are simply part of the convivial arena. For me, conviviality can't assume a post-racial or post-conflict imagination. It can only attempt repair. This brings me to my third of 3 sections. This is fairly short, not least because I'm still finding what it is I want to, finding what it is I think, finding what it is I want to know about reparative listening. Tarada's idea of conviviality, in fact, followed an assumption of injury. His approach was reparative, though he didn't use that word or theoretical framing. His lifelong commitment to research on music and minorities assumed that structural inequities often shape the very terms for musicking. Tarada's primary intellectual home was the International Council for Traditional Music and Dance, which is, as an organization, is far more purposefully international in its reach and membership than its sister organizations in ethnomusicology, in my humble opinion. And ICTMD is shaped by the values driving UNESCO, right? It's explicitly linked to UNESCO. Now, Tarada served as an elected officer for ICTMD, and he was a core member of its study group on music and minorities for decades. So our book is shaped by his many years of dedicated involvement in those circles. Indeed, some of the contributing authors to our book were his longtime friends and colleagues from that study group. The study group has published quite a few edited collections based on their biannual conference, and Tarada was a co-editor of one, this one. The Vibe Study Group and the involvement of a remarkably varied group of international scholars, especially from Europe and Asia, has prompted an efflorescence of research and publications in the area, including this book that we are now putting together in Tarada's absence. So our book in progress addresses restoration, reconciliation, and the reparative. We're asking each of us in different ways, what are the pathways to repair, to better ways of being together? The time is right, I think, to turn again to researching how music can connect communities across difference. You could argue that the time to do so is always now because the need is always there. On the other hand, since 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, music scholars have shown a pronounced and rising interest in restorative justice through music. And they ask questions like, how can music provide models for disengagement and de-escalation, for instance? Jasmine Henry argues that music can only do reparative work, and she's drawing on Will Cheng's work. She says that music can only do reparative work after accountability is established. And as she puts it, racist damage is so profoundly built into the disciplines of music study that listening and accountability must precede any reparative work. Our book in progress flashes on multiple ethnomusicological commitments. Its authors address music activism and advocacy, applied and engaged ethnomusicology, post-trauma recovery, racist violence, and war zone sonics. Ethnic conflict and caste discrimination is addressed by several authors, mostly from contexts outside Global North racial ideologies. The authors offer vibrant examples of powerful experiments that pushed musicians into active, intentional conflict resolution. I've been learning from the work of Andy McGraw for the past few years. He's an ethnomusicologist, and he writes in this amazing book that music easily generates ethics, doesn't reflect them, generates ethics when directed towards relationship building. And as McGraw puts it, quote, by learning new forms of musical interaction, we often learn new ways of being together and relating to one another, unquote. And he writes that music can provide the means to shift perspective and decenter, as he puts it, any hardened sense of self. It can assume a shared sense of the common good, something that he writes about at great length. In the end, McGraw argues quite emphatically that musicians create ethical systems. Like McGraw, Tarada and I suggest that music can be reparative and can generate terms for conviviality. And this never happens automatically. It takes effort, strategy, and intent. My final section, not long, is about Tarada's presence Yeah. Um, Yoshitaka looms over the book, of course. He would and wouldn't like what I've included in this introduction. He was averse to first-person ethnographic writing, and he politely disliked the turn toward positioned ethnography. He was an extraordinarily good ethnographer, and his many publications had an empirical cast, I would say. As a full-time researcher at the Museum of Ethnology, or Minpaku, in Osaka, he produced and authored a remarkable number of books, articles, and films. He was a full-time researcher. So he was bilingual, and his work reflects his virtuosic ability to address international Anglophone and Japanese scholars. Now, as I weave together, as best I can, the strands of Tarada's thought and mine into this book, I realize that the ethics of writing with an absent colleague are remarkably like the big questions that are now at the center of North American music research. That is, what are the decolonial ethics of speaking for someone else? How can I share or cede scholarly authority? My question. Now that our book is an act of homage to Tarada, how can I recast editing as an act of conviviality? You know what? I'm going to turn off my PowerPoint and just read the last couple pages to you without, you don't need the PowerPoint for it. Stop share. Yeah. Let's make you all big here. Hold on. There you are. Yeah, I want to be able to see you. So let me reflect on each of those questions in turn, looking backwards. Editing and translation. There's no translation in the book, but I'm thinking to big dynamics here. Editing and translation, to my mind, are two of the most powerfully subject blurring engagements any scholar can undertake. The editor, or perhaps the reviewer or the academic advisor, has the responsibility to draw out the best work possible from the author or writer or student. They should proceed without bias and assess the work on its own merits, but also with an ear for how the work could expand, challenge, or redirect the status quo. The editor can suggest but not dictate. The editor is emphatically not a ghostwriter. They should listen for how the author might be encouraged to take the next step, to articulate contributions they were still figuring out. The editor is actually trying to expand what the author is capable of or willing to say. And translation is a close cousin to editing. Translation demands a terrible intimacy across worlds and subjectivities, but it involves transformation because language casts the very terms through which worlds are constructed. So writing this introduction with Tarada alongside him in his absence has been a strange and troubling experience. Frankly, it has been easier than writing with him present, alive, and in real time. We talked at great length about this introduction, yet never actually started writing it together. How about that? I took copious notes on our plans. Whenever we talked, I had my notebook right there. We talked about the points we wanted to make, the sources we wanted to cite, and so on. And late in the project, when he came and spent that month in Riverside, California, so we could edit the author's first drafts, and the plan was to write this introduction, I could never quite get him to begin. It was odd and surprising. I generally deferred to him because he was the project's instigator, and he had experience editing collections, and I didn't. As one week and then another went by, I began to wonder why he wasn't taking the lead on the introduction, and I was keenly aware that the opportunity to work together closely and intently in real time was slipping away. I still don't know why he wasn't motivated to begin work on this introduction. It's possible that I was more interested in making critical arguments than he was. He could have easily written a perfectly adequate descriptive introduction by himself, simply by summarizing the author's contributions, which he proposed at one point. And whatever the obstacles, we never started writing together. So I am now trying to write in a way that combines respect, our different points of view, and homage. Without question, this book is now drawn together in Tarada's honor. All the authors agree on that. But the odd authority I have in writing alone but not alone is confusing. It demands that I challenge Tarada's thought as best I can, which means I frequently write as a kind of imposter, since we were, in the end, very different kinds of scholars. Despite our many shared interests and values, we were different, and I'm sure that's why he brought me on as his co-editor. The many times I ceded authority to him, he would invariably, politely deflect it, and then vice versa. And that pendulum is still swinging here between the two of us on these pages, between our different perspectives and aims. Tarada wouldn't like these final pages. They're too personal, too positioned, and too autoethnographic. He would suggest that we remove this ending and instead conclude with some final thoughts about the book's purpose. I'm sitting with his polite discomfort, and I explain to him again that the need to find better ways to not speak for others, but instead to speak alongside and to listen better and to cede authority is now part of ethnography's decolonial ethics. My personal protocol has been to invite him to speak and write this introduction to the best of my abilities without concealing myself or seeming to speak for him because I can't. So writing this introduction with Tarada, but not with him, has been a shock to my system in several different ways, from the need to take on a responsibility I hadn't expected to the possibility, or rather the impossibility, of invoicing a colleague I deeply respect. The structures, styles, forms, and layers of our many conversations over many years about music and conviviality have pushed me to experiment, at least a little, despite Tarada's silent disapproval, with the genre of the introduction here today. And that's what I've got at this point. That's what I have. Thank you very much for listening. There's nothing in the chat. I'm so disappointed. Perhaps you could begin to add things now. But I turn it back to Professor Schossberger to bring in the conversation.
Thank you so much for this extremely sensitive and rich talk and this fascinating and thought-provoking introduction to this book that I'm now really looking forward to reading. So really, thank you so much for this. And I would like to maybe immediately proceed to our response session. And if all of you or any of you has questions, I think we will have time later on with the QA session. So without further ado, let me introduce our first respondent. Dr. Abigail Wood is a senior lecturer in ethnomusicology at the Department of Music, School of the Arts, Culture and Hermeneutics, University of Haifa. She is a former co-editor of Ethnomusicology Forum. Her research is primarily concerned with musical life in urban spaces, from contemporary Jewish music to Palestinian wedding musicians in the Galilee. She currently holds an ISF grant together with Naomi Cohn-Centner, embodying spiritual sound, new musical practices among religious Jewish Israeli women. Abigail, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah, for sharing your work with us, and thank you, Barak, for inviting me to respond. Let's start by saying that this is an unusual paper to respond to, as it leaves as much missing as it reveals. It's the introduction to a book that none of us here have read, and it's written in the presence of an absent co-author who you know well, but most, if not all of us here don't. I think our setting, however, is a productive one in which to respond to this presence and absence. We're here together in this virtual room, which tends to blur difference, but we're in reality half a world apart. And I assume that precisely this together and not togetherness is one reason why you chose this particular paper to share with us here in Israel. So beyond the surface tension of your conversation with Tarada about the framework of conviviality lies anxiety about our contemporary world. The realities in which we work and write are in urgent crisis. You're writing in an America reeling from Trump's re-election and the ways in which the following storm of statements and policy decisions are challenging ways in which democratic America thought about itself and its fragile democracy. And of course, nobody knew when this lecture was planned that you'd be speaking at the end of what's probably been the hardest day for Israel as a nation since October the 7th, which has left us heartbroken and literally speechless when we feel helpless, not only in the face of enemies, but also in the face of our own decision makers. Where do we even begin to look for conviviality? And amid the history of human response to crisis, I never heard anyone asking, is there an ethnomusicologist on board? So we're stuck. It's up to us to write ourselves into that picture. And you share with us Tarada's desire to explore the potentials of performing arts, I'm quoting, to help attain an amicable world, while sharing your own misgivings about the potential naivety of his concept of conviviality. Turning back to the moments of crisis, they can be the ones that provoke us, not in the black and white shouting on social media, but I'm thinking about the work of people like Israeli literary scholar Ayelet Ben Yeshai, who's coming from a rich background of decolonial and literary theory, but drawing on completely new directions to make theory work in our present reality, to make it possible even to think of a way back to the convivial. But turning back to your paper, towards the end of your talk, you listed the 12 questions that you and Tarada crafted for the authors of the book chapters, and you suggested that you should focus on 2 of them. I quote, how does music help create the means and terms for productive relationships between different communities and within a community? And what words or terminology do the communities in question use to talk about purposeful connection across difference? One of these questions focuses on practice, music itself as a paradigm for productive communication. And the other focuses on words and terminology. How do people talk about that connection? And your description of your relationship with Tarada seems to encapsulate the difference between these questions. Do we trust our understanding to emerge from the practice or the ethnography, or do we put it into words, but then face the methodological centrality of suspicion that you talk about, at least in the written version of the chapter? But while focusing on music and on words, your 2 questions also share a theme, productive relationships and purposeful connection. You're rightly realistic about the extent to which these reparative relationships might actually happen or change structural inequalities. And I thought of 2 kind of examples from my own teaching. I remember a chastening moment when a student told me about how he felt participating in a joint project which had Palestinian and Jewish Israeli participants. The project was immensely uplifting, but the participants had been given no strategy of coping with the reality that they'd returned to. Their perspectives had changed, but the change wasn't echoed by the world around them. The structural inequities continued. The project was therefore productive. It produced frustration. Conversely, when I spent days preparing last summer for a session for a group of Jewish and Palestinian Israeli students in Haifa, leading to a music exchange project in Germany, and asked them what they would like the German students to understand about their experiences of the war, they told me in no uncertain terms, tell them if they want to know about the war, they can ask Google. We're sick of talking about it. So for these musicians, the only way to create purposeful connection was not to put it into words. But this time, the disconnect between outside reality and the perspective of the project was under their control. So in other words, I think that we should also bear in mind that the often large gulf between the language that we have to talk about the problematics of musical conviviality and the ways in which musicians actually hold and work with that complexity and problematize themselves the ideas of conviviality with which they faced. So is it up to us to decide, as you ask, whether music makes a difference? And is there a static answer to that question? And just one other comments, turning back to ourselves as ethnomusicologists and reading your chapter from afar, I was actually struck by one word that you use often, which is we. And you use we in 2 contexts. The first we is you and Tarada. How might we see the productive difference within that we not just as individual interpersonal difference, but also as culturally embedded. You talk about the SEM and ICTMD difference, but also national and other identities that are brought into that conversation. And how can we grasp the knowledge that emerges from that meeting point? The second we that you invoke is the disciplinary we, which is sometimes you acknowledge as North American and sometimes less so, and can attending to difference within that we, while as scholars actively seeking conviviality rather than suspicion in the scholarly encounter, can that offer us insights into productive relationships and the shifting perspectives that you're seeking? And I was struck by the important insight in the 4 key terms that you identified from Tarada's work, his attention to difference, place, presence, and dignity, with the lack of rush to understanding. And reading your chapter, as much as it drew me to think about conviviality in music, I ended up thinking about conviviality as scholars. Could we equally apply these thoughts and themes to our own meeting points as ethnomusicologists, as we do to the musical encounters we study? Thank you again for sharing this very productive chapter with us.
Thank you. That was, oh my God, that was so useful. And we didn't talk about this, but if you'd be willing to share the written form, it seemed like you were speaking at least from notes.
Of course.
I would be so grateful. I would be so grateful. I want to grab a number of the points.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Wong, would you like to respond to Abigail right now, and then we'll hear Rachel, or hear Rachel first and then respond to both of them?
Thanks for putting that out there. Real quick, I do want to say I love that last point about what about thinking about conviviality as scholars amongst between each other ourselves. Boy, oh boy, I took out the whole section on Sedgwick and paranoid reading, as you may have noticed. But it's precisely that kind of restorative, reparative reading, that she's proposed that has been so interesting to so many of us in the humanities. And yes, I'm with you on that. What if we thought about this in terms of scholarly sociality, right? Yeah. Thank you, too, for positioning everything we're doing together today in terms of the hardest day ever for Israel. I didn't do justice to that context. I'm at the beginning of processing it as much as the rest of you. But of course, it's been an unending horror for 500 plus days at this point. So that is also the context in which I found myself writing this introduction, which I now need to write into the introduction. But I very much appreciated your questions around what happens when structural inequities persist without end. How do we think of conviviality in those environments? Excellent question, Abigail. And what about? Thank you. That sort of identifying that gulf between language and musical praxis and the ways in which each has potential and limitations. And finally, thank you for that question about where is the we? Who is the we? What are the different ways in which I am unthinkingly using the we? And I'm going to go back and really drill down on that much more carefully than I have. So thank you. Thank you for that gentle but pointed suggestion. It was very useful. Okay, I'm doing too much talking. Barak.
Yeah,
let's turn to my other.
Let's just jump forward. So our second responder is Rachel Pinhasi. Rachel is a PhD student in the musicology department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, starting in 2023. Her research is conducted under the guidance of Dr. Oded Erez. In the field of popular music in Israel, her research interests focus on Mizrachiyut and Masortiyut, and the participation of ethnicity and religion in shaping national identity. In addition, she is a research partner in an ethnographic study focused on observant Jewish women in Israel working as DJ and all-women DJ courses and dance parties. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Hi. And thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you, Barak, for the invitation. I want to take advantage of the fact that I'm the young scholar in this conversation and to think out loud about some of the issues that concern me in my research. And I would like to share some thoughts and mainly to ask questions that occupy me in work regarding ethnography and ethics. As Barak said, I study popular music in Israel, and my PhD focuses mainly on mainstream pop. And since October 7th, conducting research became much harder, not only because of the daily struggle of just living here, but also because I face the challenge of doing ethnography at home, including a lot of virtual ethnography that deal with the present situation during war. And popular music and popular culture does not exist separately from politics or merely reflects it, but may create political and cultural change that sometimes has real life and death consequences, I think. And my materials sometimes include violence, racism, or superiority, and I see again and again that music may create harm or accelerate violence. And beside my complex feelings toward my field and people I also love and appreciate, I find it very hard to do ethnography when my positionality is so complicated, being at the same time an insider and an outsider. And as a citizen, I constantly thinking of repairing, and I try to think how academic work may contribute to repairing, and especially ethnographic work. So I want to begin by returning to Walter Benjamin discussing the concept of history by referring very briefly to one of the important sections, the seventh one. And I would like someone to read, please. Is there someone who can volunteer? Efrat, thank you.
Sure. You want me to read what's read?
Yes, I think we don't have enough time to.
Okay.
all of it.
History is the object of a construction whose place is formed not in homogeneous and empty time, but in that which is fulfilled by the here and now. I'm jumping. The same leap into the open sky of history is the dialectical one, as Marx conceptualized the revolution.
Okay, and actually, it is not the correct slide. I meant to begin here. So let's please read again this section, and then I say something about it. Sorry.
The nature of this melancholy becomes clearer once one asks the question, with whom does the historical writer of historicism actually empathize? The answer is irrefutably with the victor. Those who concurrently rule are, however, the heirs of all those who have ever been victorious. Empathy with the victors thus comes to benefit the current rulers every time.
Okay, and please continue here.
There has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. And just as it is itself not free from barbarism, neither is it free from the process of transmission in which it falls from one set of hands into another. The historical materialist thus moves as far away from this as measurably possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain.
Thank you. So Benjamin asked, with whom does the historical writer of historicism actually empathize, and answer that irrefutably with a victor. Those who currently rule are, however, the heirs of all those who have ever been victorious. And he concludes with a memorable task for the historian to brush history against the grain. And ethnography is not history. And one of the difference, but also maybe a similarity, according to Benjamin, ideas regarding time, is that ethnography is done in the present and deals with the present. As Benjamin wrote, history is the object of a construction whose place is formed not in homogeneous and empty time, but in that which is fulfilled by the here and now. And later, Benjamin refers to revolution. That's the slide that I mistakenly began with. And he explains that materialistic historism is based on constructive principle. And I don't want to read it now again, but to return to ethnography while thinking about the relation between the past, present, and future, I want to think about our role as ethnomusicologists. We may not call what we do applied ethnomusicology, but I think that we do it nonetheless because ethnography is an intervention both in our engagement in the field with people we meet, but also in our storytelling choices. Writing is a process of knowledge production that raises ethical and epistemological issues. And I think that our ability as music scholars to contribute to society is striking when we think about minorities, contribution to society, collaboration between musicians and artists, and more. And there is a lot of work to do. But I want to return to the idea that ethnography is an intervention and we are narrators of a present story. And I'm afraid that we may neglect the majority and miss a potential for change by doing it. And I'm looking for a way to create ethnography not only as ethnography of the majority, not only as a testimonial document against the ruler, but also as an alternative option to the victor story that challenge it from inside. For example, by telling complex stories about mainstream culture, as I try to do, that may not have one political bottom line, for example. I think that it is too easy and that it is also maybe bad research to do such a thing. And I would like to explain my point with the idea of taxidermy from a great article that was written about the 1922 movie Nanook of the North, with its problematic colonialistic representation of the Inuit, with the mythical, authentic first men representing Inuits as they are phrased in their primitive or authentic culture. Let's see a picture that represents it. Shortly, one of the questions in this article is how can ethnographers avoid the taxidermy impulse? Obviously, in a colonial sorry, let's read this too. Efrat, can you please again?
Taxidermy seeks to make that which is dead look as if it were still living. Thus, in order to make a visual representation of indigenous peoples, one must believe that they are dying, as well as use artifice to make a picture which appears more true, more pure. As intended, however, this form of ethnographic film, infused with the notion of death and the idea of vanishing races, is a cinema of archetypical moments endlessly repeated.
Thank you. So this endlessly repeated thing, by looking for the pure essentialist representation of the others, is something that I want to ask about, because obviously in a colonial context, the subjects are the others who belong to the disadvantaged minorities or oppressed. And our research needs to be aware of stereotypes, power relations, and racism that can cause us to do bad research, both scientifically and ethically. But in the last centuries, in this movie, the situation and politics have changed, and the voices of the oppressed and the others are increasingly heard in academia. But I wonder, how can we avoid moving from taxidermy of the other from the past colonial point of view and its fetish for authenticity, which freezes the time in search of the pure essence of the other, how can we avoid the moving from this to a taxidermy of the dominant, telling a story that is also above time and freezes the capitalist realism? So I want to finish with a question. Can I or we brush history against the grain and contribute to the future as a narrator in the present by doing a challenging ethnography of the throngs, for example, challenging national narratives? Is it a matter of storytelling and enabling them to change instead of freezing them as stuffed animal in the opposite way than the century years ago? Thank you.
May I just respond just a bit? Rachel, that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you for engaging so closely and thinking so deeply. Yeah, thank you. You know, the answer to those questions at the very end that you posed, those important pressing questions you posed at the end, I think the answer is yes, 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 yes. You know, that's the work that we all need to do and to do together, no doubt. I loved your attention towards the end to storytelling as a possible strategy and method. You know, in my readings on restorative justice of all kinds, storytelling is often brought up as an absolutely key methodology. But really, most deeply, I really appreciate your attention to time, you know, past, present, future, all times. You know, I appreciate the ways in which, you know, you're identifying that ethnography, sure, it's an intervention, but I think we all know that the Achilles heel of ethnography is many of the unmarked ways that it focuses on the Jetztzeit, on the now, the ethnographic present, you know, as a driving value, really, you know, which I think that those of us who do ethnography have used to very good effect. But you're pointing out that it really comes, it has risks that come with it, you know. So I can tell you're impatient for change. I want to see those changes too. I especially want to see how you and your generation, you know, push those changes forward. And if we are going to think of ethnography and its potential for change, if we are going to do a kind of work that is not taxidermy, oh my God, I hope not, you know, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do something better than just make the dead appear living, right? So thank you for that turn into Fatima Roni's work, because it's quite relevant to what we're trying to do here. So does the ethnography of advocacy begin to push against those temporal assumptions, the emphasis on overemphasis on Jetztzeit that can lead to the triumph of the barbarians? I don't know, but naming them as such strikes me as more than a good start. Yeah, more than a good start. Yeah. So thank you for that informed and gentle yet clear provocation that you just offered. And I can't wait to get to know more about you and your work. Yeah, because clearly you're doing very interesting and challenging intersectional ethnography. So I'd love to hear more about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, listen, that was really amazing. Both responses were so insightful, and I'm just in awe for this conversation that was happening here. Let's open our session to questions from anybody else. Does anyone have a question or a comment or a thought? Ruth, let's see. See? There you go.
Hi, everybody, and hello, Deborah. It was a pleasure. And I want to say that in this evening in particular, I don't know whether this is the saddest day in the last 500 and something days, but certainly there was a mode of consolation in this session that I want to express in the very fact that, first of all, the way that you shared with us your work, and also Abigail as well as Rachel, first of all, there is a sense of the strongly ethical commitment that is shared by the three of you is unto itself in this very dark times that we are all having here in the United States, is something that strengthens us all, and I appreciate it a lot. And being myself a cultural historian of music, and not an ethnographer in the way that you are, which is something that I really admire, I was very interested in the way that you exposed the whole field, how it evolved in the last 20 years or so, and gave me some insights and some new understandings. And also I appreciate the way that you pinpointed the differences between you and your late dear friend. Excuse me, I didn't write down the name, and it's a Japanese name, and I couldn't remember it exactly. And also the position yourself within the different methodologies. What I would like to hear more, if possible, is what you have gained from these 12 questions that you positioned. What sort of learning? You talked about case studies, and that the case studies is that which really directed the work of most of these scholars. But I would like, since I'm interested in the questions from my point of view, I'm very interested in them. What sort of new ideas, insights, even methodologies, as well as modes of thoughts that you inferred from all those. So not everything, but first 1, 2, 3 examples that can be of interest to us, if it's possible.
Good to meet you, Ruth. Oh man, you're saying you're being very nice, but you're also saying, okay, and I'm like, maybe I should try to answer some of my own questions, right? Fair, that's fair. Yeah, and I am critiquing the case study approach as being worthy, but not enough in the end. Therefore, what happens after we acknowledge it's not enough? What comes next? My feeling is this. I'm really paying a lot of attention, to be very just sort of nuts and bolts pragmatic for a minute. I'm really admiring ethnomusicologists who have managed to step into public policy work. And I would venture to say that 99.9% of us are not trained to do that, in your traditional PhD programs, right? So not only are we belatedly learning to take an approach of advocacy, but then how do we actually move our ideas into, the public sphere, not just the public sector, but the public sphere in a Habermasian kind of way. I'd like to see it. I love beautifully crafted essays, and I love opinion editorials, and I love the ways in which humanities scholars are so good at articulating problems. But I want to see all of that go further than just articulating problems, So this is why I'm thinking of Tan Sui Bang, who's one of our authors, who is literally involved in several different. She lives in Penang or Penang, in Malaysia, right? She's been there for a very, very long time. Bye, Edwin. But she's literally gotten involved in local efforts to write cultural policy for that province, and I'm like, yeah, I would like to see more music scholars who are able to do that, willing to do that, because it means learning entirely different logics, right? Not entirely, but mostly different logics. Yeah. So that's a practical answer to your question. I think the deeper thing for me is to recast the humanities. And again, I'm just like this whole Eve Sedgwick thing. We are all of us so thoroughly stuck in what she calls paranoid reading. Again, I removed this from the essay and the presentation today, but it is my ongoing question about whether it's possible to redirect the humanities away from defensive paranoid work, by which I mean only looking at what's wrong with objects, or not, even if not only, assuming that is the primary framework, finding the weaknesses kind of approach. And I have amazing friends like Sherry Tucker and others who teach in a way that is completely the opposite of that. Who manage not just to teach how to find the weakness in the article, but how to find the things that could actually be activated and operationalized to create something different. Yeah. So I'm thinking about the ways in which the humanities operate. I would like to see a real shift in how that happens. And this is precisely the historical moment in my country where that's not going to happen unless all of us are going to do it at ground level, right? Because clearly the governmental structures are not going to be the place to do that work, at least for the next little while. Yeah. Wow, I just did a lot of thinking out loud. Thank you for the question, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, there's much to talk about, but no doubt about things.
Anyone else wants to agree, disagree? Yeah, Kate.
Hey.
So good to see you, Dr. Wong.
Likewise.
I think Dr. Wood was speaking about the flexibility of we in your conversation, and that's something that I wanted to come at in a different way. You are co-editors with Terada-san, and the co implies kind of an equity, yes, but I'm interested in yes and no. Yeah, right. But along the way, there almost seemed like there was this implicit cultural framing of the process of co-writing, in which you positioned yourself, especially the story of his resistance to starting the introduction when you were together in Riverside. You positioned yourself almost as a kohai, and there was this in the conversation, the potential of starting but not starting. It almost felt like Ma, in a sense, this potential laden presence absence in your conversation with him. And so I may have seen something that is not there, but what might be added if your work together in crafting the introduction, your work physically together in the past, your work together now in the present, can be understood as rooted in this sort of fundamentally Japanese aesthetic and relational practice. And is it the deeply particular, but also the transformation of that on the ground theory? So it is a case study. It is ethnographic in a very bigger than just the eye ethnographic way. Is this something that could have relatability and utility for readers, for consumers of the book also?
Ooh, okay, yeah. Like, boom, great question. Couple of responses. Yeah, you're right. I do want to do that, and I've took a baby step into doing that, but I need to do more with that, without it all becoming about me struggling through my own stuff, right? Because I remain certain that the exercise I'm in the middle of, which is editing the book, writing the introduction, co-writing the introduction, that's a contained exercise. But I do think that it reaches beyond this little thing I'm doing, and I think it speaks to the ways in which we could think about knowledge production more broadly, right? I'm a little leery about going too far with the Japanese interpretation of what the heck was going on between he and I in our working relationship, right? Because he was so funny. He would always describe himself as, I'm just a typical Japanese man, but in fact he was anything but typical. And he was profoundly bicultural in lots of ways. So I don't see him as always proceeding from some kind of Japanese social aesthetics, or ethnopoetics. I think that perhaps sometimes he was and often he wasn't. And I love hanging out with Japanese ethnographers from different disciplines because they're constantly questioning the terms for their own society, as ethnographers in many places do, right? It comes back to defamiliarization of your own environment. But with that said, now that I just said he's not Japanese, there was a lot of I did defer to him in all kinds of ways, not in those literal ways because he's several years older than me kind of thing. No, not just that, but because it was his project to all intents and purposes. So I am performing a kind of respect behavior in the introduction, which is in fact intentional. It is deliberate on my part. That is part of the not only the dynamic of collegial friendship between the two of us, but also what I think that scholarship could maybe use a little bit more of sometimes. Yeah. Not in any blind way, but because of my actual real respect for the work that he did and the door that he opened. Yeah. So senpai kohai, I mean, yeah, though he would have absolutely refused that was the dynamic. He would have denied it. Yeah. But it was something that I was engaged with as respect for him. Yeah. But you two are saying do more with the we, do more with the ko. I can and I will. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Does anyone have any other questions, thoughts, pushing backs? I just want to remind of our international visitors that it is 9:37 p.m. in Israel, but I think the conversation is lively and engaging. So whoever has anything else to say, please speak now. Yes, yo, go ahead.
I don't really have anything very interesting to say, except for the fact that this has been very thought-provoking and very interesting. But I did want to thank you for what I think is a tremendously convivial gesture, having come to talk to us, or not come to talk to us, to talk to us, to present this talk to us at a time like this when I think many of us are feeling very isolated and as you have sensed, I think, here in a lot of distress. So I just wanted you to know that this means more than you could possibly imagine, and we're very grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We all second that, I think.
I don't want to, if anybody else has something they want to say, but what do you mean by feeling isolated at this time?
Well,
is that,
yeah,
how does, yeah.
We don't really know where there's hostility coming from, but there is hostility coming from many places. And therefore it means a lot for us to know that there are people who are just willing to be part of it's not stating a position, but it's just willing to share be part and to contribute to conversation and to academic conversation, which I believe is one of the most important ways of supporting the right kind of approaches to what is going on, as you say, both in America in a different way and here. So I think that academia supporting academia is one of the most important things that we can do for one another, rather than academia boycotting academia, which is also one of those things that looms large at the moment. So for that, we are grateful.
Okay, that is what you meant. I didn't want to assume. Yeah. I'm acutely aware, of the call to boycott. And just for the record, in many ways, I think that historically boycotts have been very effective as a means for change, a lever for change. But when it comes to academics boycotting other academics, and I understand that it's about institutional formations, not individuals, I get worried at that point. I get worried at that point that we're shutting down the lines, cutting the lines of communication at a point where that's one of the main things that could begin to leverage structural change, So as tough it is to at this particular moment to believe that structural change is possible, but that's why I chose to keep the door open. You're all gracious enough not to ask me why I chose to proceed with this in the face of the calls to boycott. But it was a real decision on my part. Yeah. Thank you, Yoel.
Really, thank you for these words. It does mean a lot for everybody. I think you'll put it perfectly, really perfectly, especially today, but for the past 500 days. So if nobody else wants to add anything.
May I just add, in relation to what you've said, Yoel, and then Laura, that boycotting is, speaking of conviviality that you have mentioned as well, is the worst thing that can be done if we want to repair the world. We are for that. Because in academia, it is the place where we are training the future students to think, to criticize, to broaden their horizons, to be committed to truthful statements, to have the tools to somehow clarify to themselves how one does it. All these really major things that we are trying to do in academia. And once anybody is boycotting that, then the future of the society is really doomed, because we won't be able ever to repair that. I mean, to build anew, that's a problem also in the United States at the moment. To build anew that which has been destroyed is so difficult. And so we are doubly appreciating people who understand that no really redemption, no saving of the world will come through this kind of boycott. But boycott in general, I think, is not a very good idea. And this case of South Africa tells a lot, because for them to rebuild culture is so difficult. So thank you again, also for my perspective.
Thank you. I feel like I've gone into a somewhat ethnographic mode of simply trying to learn from what you all are thinking and saying and feeling in this room. Yeah, because I've had very, very little direct contact with the struggles of your region, besides Palestinian American and Jewish American friends, of course. But that's different than what you all live. I repeat that boycotts have served a really important and effective role in history. I mean, I'm from the country that produced Rosa Parks, for heaven's sake, but it's the looming threat of silencing and censorship and the end of free speech that really concerns me. So that's where I come down on this very specific proposed boycott of Israeli academic institutions. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Ruth and Yoel, yeah, on this point.
Right. So it is getting quite late. It is, I think, an extremely important discussion. Therefore, I have one announcement, well, sort of an announcement to make. If any of you, and I will, of course, write this over email, if any of you want to continue this discussion about any of the topics that Professor Wong has raised in her talk, or that Abigail or Rachel was raising, or in the conversation that we had right now, you'd be able to do so in a discussion group, in a virtual discussion group. I think it is the Google Groups, over Google Groups. I'll send you all the information about how to register for one of these groups. And we can continue the discussion, this really important discussion, there in written form. And that's it. I think I want to thank from the bottom of my heart Abigail, Rachel, and of course Deborah for an really thought-provoking and amazing, I would say, conversation. It was a real conversation between. I can say that's exactly what this lecture series was meant to do. So thank you so much for all three of you. Thank you so much for all the other participants. And I wish you all good night or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And I hope to see you all very soon, in person or virtually.
Thank you for your leadership, Barak. Yeah.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.